Welcome to The Daily Pause with your host, Ron Powers.
Hello, welcome again to another Daily Pause. This is Ron Powers with Wake the Bear Radio. And what we do is we take a pause periodically when we see an interesting news item or we want to do a deeper dive. And the deeper dive that I have been working on has been the identity of Israel, understanding Israel in these times. And so I've done a series. This is going to be a part 8 of the series. And basically, it affects everything that we do. Believe it or not, it literally affects everything we do. You know, who is controlled? Who is the controllers? Who are the puppet masters? And Israel, you know, Q had mentioned that we'll save Israel for last. We'll find out what that means. But one of the big things with going through this series is understanding Israel, because I really believe there's a lot of confusion who Israel is. You always hear, you know, God's chosen people and a bunch of people in Palestine. And if you look at the scriptures to try to figure out who these people are in the end, because there was a lot of disruption in their histories. Israel was taken into captivity. Israel was split into two. You had the northern 10-tribe kingdom called Israel, and you had the southern kingdom called Judah, or the tribe of Judah, or the house of Judah. And that actually consisted of Judah and Benjamin and parts of Levi. So it can be very confusing who is who. And so you had all these promises. So what we did is we started the series, and the first one was just going over what are the definitions. And so we went through that, you know, what's a Jew? And I say that every time I start another series, you know, a Jew, a Judaite, Israelite, and Israeli, you know, Semite and all that. Then we went into a part 2, which we went into the Khazars, which is actually a kingdom where most of your Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europeans come from. And they were a kingdom that converted over about 1000 AD, or about 800 AD, I should say. And they don't have an ounce of Hebrew blood in them. So it's very interesting. They're descendants of Japheth. Then we went into a part 3 where I went over, you know, what people are looking at today, Gog and Magog. They identify that as Russia, and that Gog and Magog is going to come down from the north and going to invade Israel, and Israel's going to win. And so everyone's looking at this, not everyone, but lots of people are looking at this like, oh, what's Russia doing with Israel? And Israel's going to win. And well, is that really what it is? Because in that description, it talks about the land of unwalled villages, people living in security and safety. Well, Palestine, as we know, is anything but that. I mean, you know, just barricades and barbed wire and fences and bars and all those things. And so quite the opposite. Then we went into part 4, understanding Israel in these times. And it was the New Jerusalem. There's a lot of future hopes and a lot of descriptions of things that are going to happen in the future. New Jerusalem. And so we went over that. Actually, I did that in 2 parts even. And then we went to a part 5, which was the Esau-Edom connection. Basically, I did a little bit of history of the Talmudic Judaism, and you know that's supposed to be the most sacred of the scriptures for you know, your present day Jews and that are involved in Judaism. And so we looked at that. We went back into its history and who is Esau? Esau was traditionally an enemy of Israel, and he was Jacob, Israel's brother. As well, he forsook his birthright. And anyway, you find out that, you know, much of Esau's descendants, who were the enemies of Israel, became Jews. And so they were converted, forced conversion even. And so you see that playing a role today, especially when you look at Revelation, where it says, beware of those who call themselves Jews and are not. They lie, for they're the synagogue of Satan. So we look into that whole Talmudic Judaism and see if that really is what fits. Then we talked about 2 different destinies in part 6, which was the house of Israel and the house of Judah. They're totally 2 different destinies. And the house of Israel was given all these amazing promises. They'd be a great and mighty nation. They'd be a company of nations. They would own the wealth of the seas and the land and all these things. And they'd be God's battle axe. And you see what happens to Judah after Jesus comes. He pronounces judgment on him. The kingdom of God has left you. It's been taken from you and given to another nation. And so what nation was that? And so we talked about that. Then we went into, which was the last one, which was part 7. And it was the Celto-Saxon peoples. Basically what we were doing is we were following the descriptions given in the scriptures of what Israel is to become. And it seems like Israel's Celto-Saxons. And when I say Celto-Saxons, I'm talking about the Anglo-Celtos or the Celts, the Scandinavians, the kindred people of that, Aryan, all those groups of people in Northern Europe basically fit in that whole group. They came from the Scythians, ultimately, which came from the Sake, which came from Israel when they were taken to the city of the Medes. And so now we are finally at part 8. And part 8 is more just more scriptural definitions of what Israel is to become, what they were promised. So I'm going to put that up, and we're just going to go through that today. I think it'll be very valuable, especially when we talk about some of the immigration issues that we're having right now in the United States. How does that affect how we view? Well, it all ties together. And so I definitely wanted to put that up there and show you. So what do we have? We have these geographical aspects found in Scripture. Israel's to have a new home. Okay, well, that we'll go over details. Israel's to be gathered from remote countries, coasts, and islands. Israel's to colonize and spread abroad. That's very interesting. Israel's to find the inhabitants diminishing before them. Israel's to be a land restored from the sword. What that means is not by the sword, but from oppression of the sword. And Israel's new land is to be inhabited by and gathered from many nations. And so we will dive deeper into that. I also want to give credit to where credit is definitely due. Last week I mentioned that there was a book, God's Covenant People, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, written by Ted R. Weiland, who's an evangelist teacher on many of the identity topics. Identity meaning identifying Israel. I listened to him many years ago, 700 or 800 sermons or teachings, I should say, on various things. And one of those topics was the identity of Israel that he wrote a really great book on. So I'm going to be covering that more. Last time I talked about where you can get this book on Amazon. It's not directly sold on Amazon by Ted. To Ted's knowledge, I contacted him, and it is from his website, though, missiontoisrael.org. And so if you're interested in any of those books that he has on identifying Israel, that would definitely be the place, missiontoisrael, all one word, .org. And so let's go forward. I think you'll really enjoy this. Okay, Israel's to have a new home. So in 2 Samuel 7:10, it says, I will establish. Now, Yahweh is talking to David, King David at this time. He says, I will establish a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be not disturbed again, nor will malicious people oppress them anymore as previously. That is a powerful, powerful promise, because the promise is while David is in Israel and the kingdom was united at that point, so the house of Israel and the house of Judah were together, and yet God is saying, I will plant them. Well, they were already there in Palestine area. I'm just going to say that for clarity. Wasn't called Palestine at the time, but so they were already there. And God is saying, I'm going to plant them so that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again. Well, we know that there was much disturbance again and again and again and again in old Canaan land or Palestine or old land of Israel. We know that because they ultimately got removed. Since then, they got removed by the Assyrians. They got removed by the Babylonians. And they also had many, many wars on and off with Moab and the Moabites and the Jebusites and the mosquito bites or whatever ites there are out there. There's many wars always fighting. So that definitely is not the place there. It's got to be somewhere else. And we look at Isaiah where he's talking about the future and he says, behold, these will come from afar. He's talking about Israel, Israelites. They will come from afar, and behold, these will come from the north and from the west. Now, there was no such thing as northwest, and that is possible that you can take this verse and say from the northwest. If you draw a line from Palestine area northwest, you get directly towards the British Isles and anything in between there. So you get much of Europe. In fact, you can go all the way over to the United States and Canada, and Greenland and Iceland. That would also fit in that north and west. Jeremiah 3:18. I'm going to take this banner off so I can see the rest of this. Where are those banners? Sorry, hang on. There we go. In those days, the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel, and they will come together from the land of the north to the land that I gave your fathers as an inheritance. It's a very interesting one. Could be fulfilled multiple ways. One is that the house of Judah and the house of Israel are together, living, collected together, or the house of Judah, those that are Judahites, will walk with the house of Israel to get this land, and the house of Israel being in the north. So some people have interpreted it as the Balfour Declaration, where Jews had real Jews within the groups that are not really Jews, got their land back. I don't believe that personally. I think they're talking about the house of Judah and the house of Israel being combined together. And we know that there is a regathering of Israel in the last days where the whole house, and it was even started in Paul's time where he talks about all Israel will be saved. What he's talking about is a remnant from all 12 tribes will be saved. And so, but you definitely see that there's some sort of future where the two come together. Well, if you look at, I'm going to jump ahead. So let me not jump ahead too much. Let me go to the next slide. Is it the Jews? That's the question. Well, the Jews were never given a new land where they would not be oppressed or disturbed. Okay, we know that because even to this day, as we saw the terrible attack on many Jews in October 7th this past year in 2023, that was horrific. And they keep having wars over and over and over. And I'm going to cover the list of wars since 1948, and it's pretty much constant. This is a place that is definitely oppressed and disturbed. So, keep that in mind when this is a promise and you don't see it fulfilled in that area. The majority of today are Jews today. I'm sorry, let me read that again. The majority of Jews in Palestine today do not have a racial claim to the land as outfitted in Jeremiah 3, referencing the land I, Yahweh, gave to your fathers as an inheritance. So that's very interesting. So back when he made that promise and said, hey, the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel to get the land that he gave their fathers, he's saying that the Jews today, they are not related to their fathers. So that's what's interesting. And we went over that with the Khazars, which were the majority of people. The majority of Jews today, I think 90% are of Khazarian background, and they are called Ashkenazi Jews. So keep that in mind. Let's go to the next. The next question would be, is it the Anglo-Saxon peoples? Well, these lands were settled through migration, a new land, not by the indigenous or by being indigenous to it. And so if it's northwest of Palestine, it's supposed to be a multitudinous people, a company of nations, mighty nation, a first world. When we say mighty nations, it'll be like a first world nation, not a third world or dependent nation. Nations that have been a blessing to those in need, and ruling nations. That's the promise. And these lands, if you look at the lands north and west of Palestine, you see which lands are first world, are a multitudinous group of people, a company of nations that have collectively worked together. Canada, the United States, and much of Europe. Are the immigrants that came in early American days. They came together, they forged together, became one people. So you see that is a fulfillment right there. Let's go to the next. Let's look at some of the migrations of these people. This is the tie how we would know that they are Israelites. So the last you hear about the house of Israel, they were taken into captivity by Assyria, and Assyrians took them to a couple cities, Habar, and I think Mala, if I remember right. But I know Habar, and it said the city of the Medes. Well, the city of the Medes is this lower part of this graph here, and that was about 700 BC. Almost 800, but about 745 BC, they were taken into captivity. And it's really interesting because within 100 years of that time, you already have the Sakan Sune and the Isakas um, and the Gamirians. They're all coming out at that time. So the last you hear of Israelites is the very same place is where you first start hearing the tribes of people that became Scythians. And so this is a Scythians history. This map here, it shows their migration. So they kind of went from the south of the Caspian Sea. They went left, west, and they went also right, east. And then they migrated north from there. So very interesting. And that's all backed up by history. You can find that. And so once they started going both sides of the Caspian Sea, as you see on the right side of this graph, then they started to go west. And this is where Scythia and the Scythians came, and they became the Jutes and the Vikings, the Saxons, and the Germani, or the Germani, which later became the Germans. You have what else do we have on that map here? We have the Vikings. Some of them actually went as far as France, and then they came back towards Turkey. So some were actually even returning. So very interesting migration patterns here we have. So Israel is to be gathered from remote countries, coasts, and islands. So let's read a couple of verses real quick. This is in the future. Isaiah is talking about. It says, "Listen to me, O islands, and pay attention, you people from afar." And he said to me, "You are my servant Israel, whom I will show my glory." So this is going to happen in the future. He's talking about islands. What islands are there in Palestine? I don't know of any, but you see the islands there. You see the British Isles, they're islands. And they're from afar off. They were at the very edge of the known world at the time. Here, let's read another one. "Thus says the Lord, sing aloud and gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chiefs of the nations. Proclaim and give praise, and say, O Yahweh, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. And I, Yahweh, am bringing them from the north country, and I will gather them from remote parts of the earth." Again, the north country. What's north of Palestine? When Jeremiah is writing all this. Yes. "And among the blind and the lame, the women with the children, she who is in labor with child, together a great company, they shall return here with weeping. They shall come, and by supplication I will lead them, and I will make them walk by streams of waters on a straight path, which they shall not stumble. For I am the father of Israel, and Ephraim, or the house of Israel, he was the spearhead of the northern 10 tribes. Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of Yahweh, O nations, and declare the coastlands afar off." There's coastlands. Many of these countries have coasts, are surrounded by water. "And say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock." God has promised that Israel is going to be regathered. And he's not going to forget. He's not going to lose them. He's not going to replace them with the church. This replacement theology is very, very dangerous, where they say, well, the Jews rejected Jesus, so now the church, now everybody is become the Israel. That's not. Those promises were given to a specific people, and God will keep his promises. And so we need to count on that, and you could take it to the bank. So if you look at Israel to be gathered from remote countries, coasts, and islands, I just went online and just looked at, what's the largest ancestry groups in the United States today, even. And the top one, you see German. There's a lot of Germans, which are from the Scythians, and you see the blue there, lots of blue. You have African Americans, which are spread out in the lower right, and they were taken over, very unjustly by kidnapping and forced slavery. By the way, the scriptures don't support kidnapping. It's a penalty by death, and forced slavery was only on wartime occupations. The ones that you find in the Bible that are acceptable are volunteer. There's a timeout. You could time out. Some people didn't have enough to live on their own, so they would join themselves to a house and become their servant or slave. And so there's definitely some different things than the slavery we saw in the United States. But let's go down. There's Irish, green spots there, Irish up by New York and stuff. The English, look at the English, the big red patches. The Scandinavian up in the upper part, light green, and the French is the yellow there. And then Italian. And so it goes on, and then it goes down as you get more south, you start getting more different groups that are not the groups that qualify as Israelites. But again, we have lots of people pouring into this country, big time. Mexican, you see a lot of gray. Well, that, they were there at one time and they've come over. Our borders are wide open. And so you're going to get more and more with that. But you definitely see that this country is gathered from various groups from all over, but a lot of Israelite groups, predominantly Israelite groups. Israel's to colonize and spread abroad. I don't know if you can see the background there, but you see an elephant in India and you see a British flag. Well, yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about. There's no other colonizer, definitely. So it says, your Jacob Israel's descendants shall be like the dust of the earth, and they shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you, your descendants shall be all the families of the earth be blessed. And so you saw that. Well, I'll go into explaining that in a little bit. That's Genesis. That was a promise. Let's look at Deuteronomy. As a firstborn of his ox, the majesty of his, it's Joseph's, his horns of power. Those are his two sons, two horns, and the horns of a wild ox, and let them push the people all at once to the ends of the earth. And those horns are the 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. And he's talking about that they are going to go out and they're going to colonize and they are going to push their horns of power to all ends of the earth. And in those days, in the days to come, Jacob will take root. Israel will blossom and sprout, and they will fill the whole earth with fruit. So let's look. Who can that be? Is it the Jews? Well, according to the Jewish News Syndicate, I'd looked up an article. Israel is among history's greatest anti-colonists. It says colonialism means foreigners conquering and ruling indigenous people and their lands. Thus, by no definition can Jews be considered colonists. And this was written by a Jew. And that's just one of, many, many, many articles where Jews did not colonize. As you can see, they're a small dependent country even today. They haven't taken over. They're not a country taking over other countries. Well, what country did that? Well, let's go on. Could it be the Celto-Saxon peoples? Well, I would think that's a pretty safe one there. So I'm going to take a quote from Ted on this one. It says the Celto-Saxons migrated primarily northwest of the British Isles and the North American continent, and eventually they found their way to Australia, New Zealand, India, China, Southeast Asia, and South Africa. Later, after the difficult work of colonizing was accomplished, the Jews followed the Celto-Saxons. So when you find Jews in these other areas, it's only after the Celto-Saxons took over and colonized. And how is that a blessing? You think of oppression and with the colonizing and stuff like that. Well, actually, if you look at it, these countries that were taken over are better off now today than they were had they not been taken over. So what came with the British people? Well, they came with roads, hospitals, schools, education. All these things came And as a result, these countries had an infrastructure that was built in a way that today has put them at an advantage of others that were not taken over. And so we see that. And so it's just something to take note here. Let's see. So a colonial pastor in the United States, Pastor Ezra Stiles, in his election sermon of 1783, he commented on the colonizing spirit of those who came to America. So it was recognized within America. It's not just something I'm proposing right now. It says already the ages has Europe arrived to a plenty, if not declining population of 100 million. In 200 or 300 years, this second enlargement may cover America with 3 times that number. It's interesting because we are about 330 million people right now. If the present ratio continues with the enterprising spirit of Americans for colonization and removing out the wilderness and setting new countries. Basically, what he's talking about is, hey, this country is going to fill up just like Europe had filled up, and they needed to go out and colonize. The British had to go out and they colonized and spread abroad. And he's saying, hey, even America is going to fill up, at the rate we're going, and then more colonization, because that's what the spirit of America is to go out and colonize. And so we see that. So Israel's land, next one, Israel's land is to be inhabited by people gathered from many nations. So it says, after many days, I'm reading Ezekiel 38:8. After many days, Gog and his hordes, or Gog and Magog, will be summoned by Yahweh himself. In the latter years, you will come into the land that is restored from the sword. Those inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste. But its people are brought out from many nations, and they are living securely, all of them. And so I highlighted the restored from the sword part. So I just wanted to read this here. Speaking from the House of Representatives, or before them, in New England, 1778, so it's a brand new country, Pastor Phillips Payson looked at the future of America and declared, to anticipate the future glory of America from our present hopes and prospects is ravishing and transporting to the mind. In this light, we Americans, the Celto-Saxons, behold our country beyond the reach of all oppressors under a great charter of independence, enjoying the purest liberty, beauty, and strong in its union, the envy of tyrants and devils, but the delight of God and all good men, a refuge to the oppressed, the joy of the earth. So what he's talking about here is being restored from the sword, is that we are beyond the reach of our oppressors. There's nobody, we are between the two great seas, the two great oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And so to have people come across our borders, we have friendly brothers above us in Canada. It's really hard to be taken over. You had all these small countries, even in Europe back in the old days, where one country would spill over to the next country and take them over. Here we are free from that oppression. So that's what the land is, what they're talking about when it's restored from the sword. Let's continue on, though. So it's gathered from many nations. Well, if you've noticed our own symbol, the E pluralis unum, it's Latin for out of many, one. And it's out of many peoples, becomes one nation. And it's very interesting. In the Federalist, John Jay, America's first Chief Justice, wrote the kinship of the early Americans. He says, I have often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give one connected country, and that's America he's talking about, to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors. These are the Celto-Saxons I've been talking about. He says, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, that's Christianity, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. So there's a very united people, and they were all different Israelites. There's different tribes, and they were different countries at the time in Europe, and they came over here. They settled as one. And that's just the symbology. It got me thinking again on that. You look at this eagle, and he's got this glory cloud above him, and he's got these 13 stars. Well, I've heard it said that the 12 tribes of Israel, they are regarded as stars. The law first mentioned when Joseph had his dream, he dreamt, and he had these stars, and they represented his brothers, and the moon and the sun was his mother and father. And that all the brothers took offense at it at the time. Jacob himself, the father, had taken offense to it, but that was the law first mentioned. Stars represent, in this case, Israelites here. 13, well, Joseph, because he became an Egyptian, his promise got split in two to his two sons. So that would add 13. So it's very interesting how we have 13 colonies. You have olive branches. Olive is very symbolic of things in the scriptures of Israel. Heck, even the arrows being held, a full quiver. They're your children. Having many children is like a full quiver of arrows, it says. And, this is definitely the descendants or the children of Israel, Israel's children later in there. And, you see this symbology in Revelation, and when you start to make the connection of who Israel is, then you start to see, this woman that was clothed with the sun, who, she was taken to the land of a great wilderness where she could renew her strength. And she was taken by the wings of an eagle. And so you see this eagle, you see the stars above her head. And she's taken to a wilderness. Well, the wilderness, the New World was considered the wilderness. The United States, that was the New World. The early pioneers, the Pilgrims, they considered it the new Israel. And so you could see that they were very similar here in their symbologies. 12 stars being the 12 tribes, and then the symbolic of being flooded. Both of them are being flooded in Revelation. This woman who gathered her strength in the wilderness for a set time. It says the serpent came after her. The serpent tried to flood her with water. Water came from its mouth and tried to overtake her. And water in prophecy generally represents people, populations. Like when the waters are still, that means there's peace amongst the people. And so this big flood came. Well, we're seeing a flood of people right now in the United States. It's very symbolic, very, very, very similar how this flood is coming. Luckily, it says the earth will swallow it up and absorb it. And so we're going to make it through one way or the other through this. But I see how you start to see things pop out like that when you understand who Israel is. Okay, so let's go on. What do we have? Israel's new land to be previously had been a continual waste. So we're going into a land that wasn't occupied by big civilizations and stuff. It says, after many days, Gog and his hordes will be summoned again in the latter years. You will come into the land that is restored from the sword. We had read this already. Whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste, to capture the spoil, to seize the plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the Israelite people who have been gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods, who live at the center of the world. What he's saying is in this prophecy, Ezekiel is saying, he's talking to Gog and Magog, which people believe are Russia, land of the north. And he's saying that, hey, this land that was previously uninhabited is now has been inhabited by Israel, and they've captured the spoil, and they've got the cattle and the goods, and they live as the center of the world. And that, I would say, would be very much like America. America came, and it was a wide open wilderness. But let's first ask, is it the Jews? Well, the land of Palestine certainly does not fit the description of an uninhabited wasteland. Palestine has been continually inhabited, and some of the most advanced civilizations during the history of mankind. The general area, including Mesopotamia, is often defined as the cradle of civilization. This was from Ted Weiland's book, The God's Covenant People. What he's saying is here is Palestine's always been filled with people. It was never a wasteland where it was empty. It was always, and it was the cradle of civilization. It was like one of the earliest settlements of humankind there. And from that point on, it's always been filled. And so to say that Israel's new land was going to be previously a continual waste, meaning it was empty lands, it just doesn't fit that at all. But what about the Celto-Saxon peoples? Well, let's read a couple things. In the ecclesiastical history of New England, Pastor Cotton Mather, writing of the dangers facing Puritans seeking asylum, pictured America as a desolate wilderness. And that was in 1702. So as these Puritans were coming over, they had viewed America as a wide open wilderness. It says, the God of heaven served, as it were, to summons upon the spirits of his people in the English nation, stirring up spirits of thousands which never saw faces of each other, with the most unanimous inclination to leave all pleasant accommodations of their native country and go through a terrible ocean into a more terrible desert for the pure enjoyment of all of Yahweh's ordinances. So what he's saying is people from all over got the same idea at the same time. They were stirred to go and leave the comfort of their homes in Europe and go to the unknown, risk their lives across an ocean, only to go into a terrible desert or a wide open wilderness of nothing and no support. And we know that because they paid a heavy toll. Even the pilgrims themselves, I think they lost 50% of the people the first year. And this definitely kept those that were just seeking fame and fortune. They just kept them at home for quite a while. It was because these people had a deeper conviction, to enjoy serving the Lord freely without being told how to serve the Lord. And I'll go on. It says, there were no roads, no harbors, no cities, no manufacturing, no civil governments, no trade to speak of, and only a very primitive type of agriculture in some of the southern tribes. There was no common language at all. In fact, no written language at all, except crude pictures. And they were talking about when they came to the country, that's all there was. So there were no roads. The Indians didn't make any roads. They didn't have any harbors. They didn't have any cities, no manufacturing. They didn't have any of these things to come to. It was just wide open, desolate place. And so that would be America, not Palestine, as you could see. And these are promises. It says Israel's to be inhabited by a people who would live securely. And we had read this before, but Ezekiel 38:8 says, after many days, Gog and Magog will be summoned by God, by Yahweh. In the latter days, you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which have been a continual waste. But the people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely, all of them. So it's the same verse we keep going over. Now we're just emphasizing every time some different point. And this one is living securely. All of them were living securely. You can kind of see the background there. Remember that old 50s picture where family, barbecuing and all that stuff? That's kind of what we have. They were living securely. They were not, under barbed wire and checkpoints and all that stuff. 2 Chronicles 17:9 says, I, Yahweh, will appoint a place for my people Israel. I will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and be moved no more. Neither shall the wicked waste them any more as formerly. So that's interesting because that sounds almost exactly like what I had read about 2 Samuel 7:10, where God was going to plant his people Israel to another place where they won't be picked on, won't be oppressed, won't be maligned. And so we see again, who can this be? Well, let's look. Is it the Jews? Is it the Jews we're talking about that are going to live in security? Well, since 1948, the creation of the state of Israel, what do we have? We have the Arab-Israeli War from 47 to July of 1949, with the Palestinian Friedan insurgency That went from the 50s and 60s. The Suez Crisis, that was in October of 56. The Six-Day War in 1967. The War of Attrition, that went from 1967 to 1970. Yom Kippur War, 1973, just 3 years later. Palestine insurgency in South Lebanon, that went from 71 to 82. 82, we had the Lebanon War. We had the South Lebanon conflict in 85 to 2000. And so you could see as we go on, it's like every couple of years, there's a war and a big skirmish there. And so there has never been peace there. And so I don't understand why people keep saying, or pastors keep saying that, hey, this is the land that, Gog and Magog is going to invade. They're not living securely. They're not living peacefully. And they are definitely not the land of unwalled villages. So could it be the Celto-Saxon peoples? Well, for over 200 years, the U.S. had not had a foreign country attack any of their states. Only the War of 1812 against the British Empire over trade agreements did this ever happen on U.S. soil. When we had like Pearl Harbor bombed and all that stuff, they weren't even a state at the time. They were just a port for us, for our Navy. And so when you do see attacks from other countries, they were not on our states. When they became an official, state of the Union, the United States, we have not had that issue. This has been a place that's been pretty peaceful. If you think about it and you compare us to other countries, we have been pretty, we definitely fit the bill of the land of unwalled villages, the land that was living securely. It says, unlike the state of Israel, the U.S. residents do not live in barbed wire, lookout towers, minefields, machine gun posts, tanks, artillery, armed troops guarding field workers, constant patrols on the border, and shooting clashes every few months with big battles every few years. That just that's not how the United States lives, but that's how the state of Israel is living. I keep just, bringing it over and over. Okay. And we talked about the land of unwalled villages or bars or gates. Again, it says, you, Gog and Magog, will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those Israelites who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates. And that's later on in Ezekiel 38:11. Is it the Jews? Well, I think, without belaboring the fact, nothing could be further from the truth. It's definitely not the Jews. There was a late Pastor Sheldon Emery of America's Promise Ministries. He's no longer with us, but he had said the following. He said, some ministers teach that these verses described a Jewish occupied Palestine. He says, nothing could be further from the truth. And that's his emphasis, all in caps. Most of the cities in Palestine, including Jerusalem itself, still have many ancient walls. And now the Jews have added concrete walls, pillboxes, sandbagged defenses, and barbed wire. Palestine is not the land of unwalled villages, nor has it ever been. And it's true, it hasn't been from day one. I mean, the Wailing Wall, the wall around the city of Jerusalem, it's always had walls. And so this is definitely not the place of unwalled villages. Okay. Is it the same, the Celto-Saxon people? Well, Emery also contrasts it with this, with the Promised Land. He says, look at the United States and Canada. It reveals a different picture. Here, we find only a land on the face of the earth, the only land on the face of the earth that is truly unwalled villages. Our Christian Celto-Saxon ancestors left their castles, their walls, their moats of the old world when they came to the new world. And our cities are without walls. It says, God, who knows the end from the beginning, can expect to be accurate in his word. So we have never had walls in the United States, even Europe, where our, Israel had migrated to before they migrated to this great and mighty nation. They had walls then, even there. So this is the place with unwalled cities, and never have had them. Okay, let's continue on. We're almost done. Let's go with the spiritual aspects. Israel is to have a new religion and to be saved by God or by Yahweh. So let's see some of these verses here, and I'll close with these. It says, Israel has been saved by Yahweh, an everlasting salvation, and you will not be put to shame or humiliated to all eternity. Isaiah. So Isaiah is speaking this. This is after, the kingdom was established in Palestine, and then it was in decline, and it was going to be punished and taken over. And so this is a future promise that God is saying. It's an everlasting salvation. It's not just for this last generation and that's it. It's going to continue for Israel. And he goes later on, he says, a redeemer, which is Jesus, will come to Zion, and those who turn from transgression in Jacob or in Israel, declares Yahweh. So there is a redeemer coming, and we know that, and that was Jesus. He came, and everyone knows about Jesus. In Jeremiah, he says, thus says Yahweh, sing aloud in gladness for Jacob or Israel, and shout among the chiefs of the nations, proclaim, give praise, and say, O Yahweh, save thy people, the remnant of Israel. That's the future promises. That's what's going to happen. A future to them. It's already happened. And then we've heard this one. Days are coming, declares Yahweh. It says, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. But this covenant, which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Yahweh, I will put my law within them, and on their hearts I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So what had happened? What is this promise that Yahweh is talking about? He's promising to write the law in our hearts. It was no longer written in stone, as he did to our forefathers. He wrote it in our hearts. That's where we accept Christ as our Lord and our Savior. We profess, we believe, we confess, we believe, we repent, and we are baptized. And baptism also represents the death of the old person coming into the new. So we need that, leave that old life behind. It's all part of the process of salvation. And so that's what he's talking about here. It's written in our hearts. Okay, so it says Israel's to have a new religion and to be saved by Yahweh. She will, now this is now a New Testament. I had said Old Testament promises. Now let's see what the New Testament says about the same thing. It says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people, that's Israel, from their sins. Matthew 1:12. It says, O Bethlehem, land of Judah, you are by no means the least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler. There's that word ruler. It's Jesus, who will shepherd my people Israel. That's Matthew 2:6. Matthew 15:24. He says, Jesus, answered and said, I have been sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Well, who are the house of Israel? Again, the house of Israel are not Judeans. They're not Judahites. They're not Jews. So he was talking about a specific people he was being sent to. I find that very interesting, especially when you hear pastors today say, oh, they're lost. They assimilated when they got taken to captivity and nobody knows who they are. Well, God knows who they are. He promised he'd regather them. He promised he would say they would join with the house of Judah as well to get their land back. And so these are all promises. You got to know who they are. So Luke, what's Luke say? Blessed be the Lord, God of Israel, for he has visited us and accomplished redemption for his people. That's Israel is talking about. To give his people the knowledge of salvation by the forgiveness of their sins. So that was during Jesus's time. Let's go beyond that. Let's see what Paul says now after Jesus. He says, who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons and the glory and the covenants? That would be the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and the Christian covenants. Christian covenant meaning the new covenant. And the giving of the law and the temple and the services and the promises. So Romans 9:4, Paul's clearly saying that Israel is, that they belong, the recipients of these promises and these covenants. Romans 9:27 says, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sands of the sea, it is the remnant of Israel that will be saved. And so that God knows where they're at. We know where they're at. And they are to be like the sands of the sea. They're not lost. They are a multitudinous people, very easy to see them if you look at all the earmarks written out in Scripture. You follow the migration patterns. You follow who is following God today, and we'll get into that. I think it's the last page. It says, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding a fault with them, he says, behold, days are coming, says Yahweh, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers. Okay, so this is not a spiritual thing. We're talking about literal physical descendants, because he's talking about not like the ones I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. That's in Hebrews. So he's talking about physical Israelites of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay, so my closing question: who received the new covenant of Jesus? Who received it? Where did the apostles ultimately go with the gospel? Well, Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. You look at where Christianity spread. Where did it spread? Where did the apostles ultimately go? If you read church history, you'll find that most of them went all up throughout Europe, Britain, France, Gaul, Spain, Italy. They went up by Romania, Armenia, even through ultimately throughout all of Europe, Scandinavian, Denmark, Dansmark, the Danes, they went there. Wherever Israelites migrated north and west, that's where the gospel went for the most part. I know Thomas went to India, talked to them, and was killed there. So let's go on. It says, where are the scriptures printed and made available for everyone? I mean, who does the printing presses with the Bible? The most made book, distributed book in world history. It came from a printing press out of those very same nations with the Reformation that came. Who are the Christian nations? They may not act Christian, but who are nations that are generally referred as Christian nations versus Arab nations or Muslim nations or communist nations or Hindu nations? What were the Christian nations? Think about it. It's the same people. And where did the Reformation flourish? I mean, when the Reformation, the Christians broke off from that grip of Rome, which was a perversion of the Christian faith as it was mixed with paganism, and they took on the pagan rituals. And that's a whole nother book and a whole nother chapter to talk about. But the Reformation is those same nations in Europe, and which people set up their governments using the Bible as their foundation. America may not be perfect as far as what a nation should be like according to Yahweh and his word, but they definitely took into consideration many objects and lessons from the scriptures. And so I ask you, is it the Jews or is it the Celto-Saxons? Who are Israel today that is found in the scriptures that they're talking about in the future, which is our time now? Is it the Jews? I think I've created a case. I think I'm going to end with this series, because it could go on, and I don't know, when you do part 32 or something like that, if people are still watching or what. But so I'm going to close it with this 8. But I think it's important to ask, is it the Jews today? Are they the chosen people? Or is there a whole nother people that's being overlooked? The Celto-Saxons or the Anglo-Saxons or the Scandinavians or the Germanics, all of these people, the Irish, they were all, and there's so much more. I mean, there was promises that David would always have a king on his throne. And it's like, well, where's that king today? Is it King Jesus? Well, there was a time when the last of Israel in the Bible was taken down. It was Zedekiah. And what happened? 400 years went by before Jesus came. What happened during that 400 years part? It said, as long as there's a sun, moon, and the stars in the sky, David will always have somebody on his throne. And so we've got to look, and there are, and I believe that throne is today, as wicked as it is at times. It's still a throne that was promised, and it was a promise given to David, regardless of what the descendants did. And so there's so many more questions, but I hope this stirs up questions for you as I close. Again, Ted Weiland, he's definitely somebody I would look into with the these bear pauses on Israel. There's so many other news items happening. I want to make sure I start covering those, so I didn't want to just go off on this rabbit trail and not come back. So this is going to be the end. I appreciate you going through it and tell others about it. I think it's an important thing, especially as we see what's happening with Israel today. So goodbye and thank you.